I wanted to do a quick post here on through some shit of December 2021, and I was just gonna kind of reflecting: is uh is Don Young the right guy at this point for Alaska Representative House of Representatives? And I just think, uh, he's been there for 50 years, right? He grew up in California. He went to college out of state. He was up in Alaska for a few years. I don't know how many years. I don't know what documentation proof is how many years he was in Alaska. Doing some school teacher stuff. No blue collar Alaska. No working class Alaska. And then he was like a state representative. And then he's down there in Virginia. And has he done a great job? What do we have to show? In terms of bullet points, that what has he accomplished in the last 50 years for the country? And I'm sure that there's tons of insight there. If you've been in Washington D.C. and involved in politics at his level, I think he should write a book. I think Don Young, Dean of the House of Representatives or whatever, he should write a book, and that should be his next chapter. And I think he's probably done some significant things, but more than that, he's been an observer for the last 50 years of sort of the trajectory of our country. And I'm sure that there's insight and lessons to be shared for everyone for in our nation, in terms of the evolution of our political that political nexus down there in Washington D.C. but also coming from someone who's going back and forth to Alaska and representing Alaska, which is a unique and changing location with the cultural history, with the demographics, with the native people there, and also with the oil development, the wilderness issues, the hunting, and all that stuff snowballing. And so I think that there's some great lessons that I think he could share for Alaska's history, but also for the nation's history. So I would love to see Don Young, maybe take a back seat, take a step back from the political sphere, and write a book and publish a book at this point in his career. 50 years in Virginia. I see some people joking online. Has he been hunting with a Virginia resident hunting license the last 50 years? He's been gone. He hasn't really. And again, circling back, this is a guy who grew up in California, went to college, in the States, and he was moved to Alaska when I think he was in his 20s. He was in the Army some, was up in Alaska for some, but then last 50 years he's been doing that. So it's sort of a question with me is, we got Murkowski down there. There's a lot of people talking about these guys crossing the line to vote Democrat. And I have concerns as someone who is very sort of centralist. And, I have concerns. I should shut my freaking car off here. Stop wasting gas. But I have concerns because I feel like, not just with like Trump and the censorship and sort of the division with COVID and all the stuff that's going on in our country. I just feel like we need to be careful. And I don't know if this other woman who's coming up trying to step in for Murkowski is the right one, but I don't want like a forced jab directory. I don't want the whole country to become like Illinois and California, where they're checking our ammo and get higher gas prices and more government, more regulation. I like less government. I like the freedoms. I like our nation's traditional values from way back in when we sort of defied Britain 300 years ago or whatever, and we stood up to the tyranny. We stood up to the oppression, and we stood for individualism. We stood for freedom, the American first thing, but also I like to take into consideration the international community and how we're depending on Mexico for all this food and all this labor. We're depending on China and Japan for these cars. We need to bolster industry and infrastructure here in our country, manufacturing and development in our country, and create those jobs and that expertise here, so that we're making the best cars here, and so that we're getting the food ourselves, and we're not relying on cheap Uyghur labor in China, where people are being harmed, because that's going to come back and harm us, and we're getting this cheap stuff for our Walmart, blah blah blah, or we're relying on the Latinos coming across the border to work in our fields down by Oxnard, California, to get all this produce that we're getting in our Fred Meyers and our Walmarts, and then we're upset when they're staying beyond their temporary work visa and they're getting a job in McDonald's, and then becomes all the immigration issues. We need to secure the border and all that. But we're relying on these people to come in here. So there's got to be some intelligent solutions. I think we're at a point in terms of global development, and not just like America's development, where there is sort of a tipping point or a need to sort of balance the big picture on our local national picture too. And I think COVID drove home a lot of those uh, the necessities there. With all of a sudden we became, when we lost our gyms, we all of a sudden a lot of people lost their work and they were staying at home, and all of a sudden everything was getting restricted, and then people began to question that and challenge that, especially when small businesses were shut down, and then the big corporate chains like your McDonald's was allowed to stay open, but the small businesses were shut down, the mom and pop, the little restaurant, that kind of thing. And we saw that there wasn't a balanced enforcement of some of these regulations coming from the big government in DC. And we were like, whoa, this doesn't make sense. This is affecting individuals in our communities and businesses in our communities. And this is a pathway that is not aligned with the tradition and with the values our country's had for the last 300 years. And I think that was when I really perked up and got more interested in politics, really was then, which was, a year or two ago when the COVID thing was going off. And I was like, one of many people, it was really the gyms. Shutting down the gyms was really the tipping point for me personally, because it was something where I had an injury before, and for my own health and fitness, I had sort of my routines, my circuits that I would do, do some cardio on the Stairmaster and the treadmill and some pull-ups, and you know what I mean? And it was really, it took the figurative magic carpet out from under me, and I even ended up doing more stuff outside, and maybe it was good for me. But right now, like I haven't worked out in days, and it did kind of knock me off my routines. And I think that is a thing that is aligned with what it did to so many people in the business community. It knocked them off their routines and their things, and the long-term repercussions for individuals, working people, but also for the business community across this country. Not just in Alaska, the smaller businesses and sort of that ecosystem of entrepreneurialism and innovation on that local small business. It has been, it was a devastating thing. So I worry, with if Don Young is the right guy for House of Representatives now, and because there is a lot of misinformation out there on both sides of the aisle on any issue right now, and I think we can see that. But if Don Young's the right guy, he needs to be interpreting and translating these bills and stuff so that people aren't concerned it's a forced jab directory. If it's something else, we need Don Young, just like I'm doing right now, to get on YouTube or to get on Instagram and to explain this stuff so that the working class people, not just the working class people, but the voters, the residents, and not just Don Young. I think all of the senators, Sullivan and Murkowski, but in Alaska, but other places too, they have an obligation. We voted them in. They need to be interpreting this stuff for us, explaining this stuff for us, not just their rationale for why they voted this way or that way, but they need to explain the ramifications of a bill and the legislation and what exactly it's going to deliver and change. So if there is a misunderstanding about a forced jab directing, it's really not doing that. It's just a trial thing. Well, maybe a trial thing's bad too. You know what I mean? Because we don't want. I think, again, circling back, you get ammo in California and Illinois. I don't think we want more regulation. We don't want the government over our shoulder everywhere, and the ramifications of how that ends up limiting so much of our freedoms that we've historically championed in this nation for the last 300 years. So what I'm trying to talk about, those values, back 1776, but also those values in 2022. So we're going into the new year here, and Don Young is, I don't know how old he is, but again, a guy who's been a California grown man who has been in Alaska briefly after his lower 48 college experience. And I moved to Alaska. I grew up in the States, and I'm not afraid of my heritage on the East Coast, in Maine, and I take pride in my background. And I don't know, does Don do that too for his California upbringing? I don't know. I think, but it's something we need to ask. Is this the guy who's interpreting these bills and this legislation the right way? Is he making the right choices for Alaska? And what has he done in the last 50 years down there? Maybe he needs to write a book. Maybe he needs to step back from politics. We need to get someone else in there. And I think, Murkowski's another one. Crossing the line and voting Democrat again and again. Is it? And I don't, I'm not trying to. It's not about these people. It's about the ramifications of their choices in their political leadership that they're in, that we voted them into. And I think it's worthy to challenge and to question. You know what I mean? I think it's worthy to challenge, to question, and to demand some answers and some explanation. Because we don't want a bunch of free money, a bunch of from Washington D.C. The pork barrel at this point. Oh, it's great. It's going to be good. We're going to build the infrastructure up with that, and in 10 years, it's not going to be able to be sustained when that federal money's gone, and the state has to begin footing the bill for all this stuff that this money is going to come for. I look at the university system in Alaska, right? We've got the university. We had so many different satellite locations just a year or two ago, and it's built up. But then, with the vetoes in the legislature, and we got people at those university positions making $500,000 a year salaries, and it's built in a way that is not sustainable. When we got the federal money, when we were building it, but when the state had to foot the bill, and it became time in the dollars, the budget had to get crunched. Well, the money's just not there. So, we had to pull back from those satellite locations. Are we just doing the same thing now with this big Build Back Better bill? Why do we even have to build back better? Those businesses never should have been shut down. I know myself and many other people would have argued if we're leaving a big corporate chain open like McDonald's, well, I don't, if we're taking out the mom and pop Italian place or pizza place who's been your, I don't think we needed to shut those guys down and leave McDonald's open. I don't think the data was there to support that. I don't think the data was there to support, shutting all the gyms down, the way that they did it. And the limitations on commerce, the limitations on economic development that went down there. I don't like how some of that stuff's in certain places and in certain realms and departments and certain parts of the economic web is still there. You know what I mean? I really feel like we needed to just, and I don't like this Build Back Better bill. It's pushing us towards socialism. It's pushing us towards what we see in California with so much regulation, so much of an open border. And California is a beautiful place where Don Young is from, where he grew up, and maybe Don Young wants Alaska to become like California. I don't know. He hasn't been up in Alaska very much. You know what I mean? And maybe Murkowski, I don't know what these guys are doing. Maybe they just want to fight Trump because of Trump's his attitude and his abrasive personality, which has been showcased in the media, and some of his bad word choice. You know what I mean? So that's one thing in and of itself. But if it's become just trying to, fight a political figure on back and forth spats in the media, which is my concern about Murkowski specifically, not talking about Don Young, but I think that's going to take away from those people's abilities to be leaders for the people, in terms of a Senate position or a House of Representatives position in 2022. These people have been there a long time, and they certainly have a great legacy and a great understanding, and have done some amazing, phenomenal things, I think, for the country, but also for the state of Alaska. But my real concern, is the path we're moving forward a good one under their stewardship? You know what I mean? So, and who would step in? You know what I mean? For me personally, do I want to be a senator right now or a House of Representatives? No. I'm just going to say it. No. You know what I mean? I don't want to go to Washington, D.C., but at the same time, I don't want to be the guy on the sidelines watching these people rip our nation's values apart, just like a piece of paper, shred it and light it on fire while I'm sitting there and watching them do it. You know what I mean? So the concerns that I and so many other Americans have right now are justified, I think, in terms of the direction our country is going, taking our rights away, censorship, telling us how to live, telling a forced jab directory we have to get. No, you know what I mean? We're not going to go down that path under my watch while I'm still breathing the air here underneath this flag, but not just this flag. I think not just our country, I think globally. I look globally at it, international community. I'm not going to let our planet go that direction. I have the vision and I have the communication skills and the leadership to push not just like a thing like the sport of dog mushing in Alaska with my one dog class idea, but I can bring the international community together, on those self-sufficient, living off the land type values, and champion, really the stuff that our country was built on back 300 years ago, and bring that back, in terms of those lessons into the political arena. I believe in the business arena as well. I look at like Dana White with the UFC, Ultimate Fighting Championships, what he's done. He's a guy from Maine. You know what I mean? He's a guy, same community my dad and my mother are from. You know what I mean? Where I grew up. I'm from that same bloodline. I can change a sport. I can I feel like I can transform the sport of dog mushing, just like they developed the CrossFit Games. I can be the next big thing in that arena, but also I will be be able to succeed as a music artist. But moreover, while I'm trying to do those things, I don't want to sit here and watch from the sideline these political leaders who have been entrenched and never challenged, like Don Young, never challenged, like respectfully, thoroughly challenged. Like no one who has run against Don Young. You know what I mean? In the last 50 years, no one. I don't know. Someone put it in the comments and tell me who. And Murkowski, she's got this person coming up from, where is she coming from? This other lady running for Senate. I don't think she's going to beat Murkowski. You know what I mean? Why doesn't Alaska, no one from Alaska wants to go to Washington, D.C. I don't think anyone wants to go to Washington, D.C., myself included. So I understand why we don't have people who it's got to be someone who just wants to be a politician and not someone who wants to be an Alaskan. So I really worry. I worry about the direction of the state of Alaska's political future. You know what I mean? And I worry. Are we going to become a democratic state? Are we going to all of a sudden be counting ammo, having Joe Biden tell us how many sheets of toilet paper we're going to be able to use? You know what I mean? And China's going to come and get the Tongass, and we're going to build another road, and all these out-of-state hunters are going to fly up and rent a U-Haul and go down there and hunt, post a YouTube video. That's not the direction. That's not the tradition and the history. We want to honor the tradition and history in Alaska of, so 2022, I hope someone challenges Don Young. I hope someone else runs and they win. And I hope that they're gonna stick to their guts and their heart and their mind, and and they're gonna be able to not vote for a forced jab directory, not have McDonald's open, but the other store closed, and I think, but again, I want to say, I think Don should write a book, Don should write a book about his all of the things he's done in the last 50 years and how that the evolution of Washington, D.C., from the perspective of an Alaskan, from someone from California, of course, right? But, of someone who's representing Alaska, which is a unique place. I think that book would be a bestseller. And I think it might be at some point, maybe, it might be the right choice and the right decision to step back from politics for Murkowski. Who's going to step in there? And I think that those are valid concerns. Maybe like Sarah Rasmussen or someone in the state political arena will be able to make that step at some point in the close future. But I don't want Alaska to become a democratic state. You know what I mean? So, and we're not even talking about new people coming in making a democratic state. These guys are crossing the line, and they're messing up our country's political future. And I worry, my children's children, and I'm not someone who thinks we need to strip mine every hill. You know what I mean? We need to dam every fucking river, and we need to put a new road in. I don't want a road to Ambler. You know what I mean? I don't want a million people flying up to Alaska, renting a U-Haul truck, going down the road for their YouTube video hunting thing so they can get a sponsor and shooting a caribou on the way to the village. You know what I mean? I'm sensitive towards environmental and conservation issues, So, but on the other hand, a lot of times conservation is more of a development thing than development. In other words, when we put in a big national park and we're bringing up all these lower 48 wildlife biology degree, park rangers and shit, and we're charging all the tourists to go out there, all of a sudden the locals are displaced, like the local natives and just the locals from Fairbanks. They can't even go out there and hunt. They can't recreate anymore because conservation, there's so many rules. But, when we look at those type of issues, weighing conservation and development, sometimes developing, putting a little mining out there, or putting a pipeline in, as long as you're not putting a big road in, it's less of a development thing than putting a state or a national park or a big wildlife refuge and putting all these rules and being this big thing, manufacturing experience for tourists so they can go take a picture of the grizzly bear or the wolf, versus just sort of leaving the ecosystem and the landscape in the subsequently and also at the same time, developing in a little bit some of the resources, the mining is sort of but in a sensitive, environmentally safe way. And but not just making this big theme park for people to go and take a picture of a wolf and a grizzly bear while they ride their bus, or you know what I mean. So what we see in like Denali National Park versus when we go down towards like or you go towards Hewley and in that kind of thing. So it's I understand the nuances. I understand the delicacies, the differences, and it's not something where it's like I think we need to. I think just the biggest thing overarchingly is Don Young needs to be challenged, and Lisa Murkowski needs to be challenged. And if they're voting this way on these issues, they need to be the ones who translate and to explain why and the ramifications and the details of that legislation, those bills, much better than they're doing for, me, for Joe Schmo, for the working class people. Because the way I see it, it's Alaska's becoming a democratic state, and these people are destroying our nations, the United States of America, the values, the freedoms. That stuff, we're going towards socialism, we're going towards communism, we're going towards a country, and we're building something in Alaska specifically with this federal money that's not going to be sustainable. Just like we saw with the universities, 10, 20 years, 15 years, Alaska, this money's not going to be there. We're going to have built something up, and we won't be able to sustain it. So where is the money going to come from at that point? Our generation, my generation, we're going to have to foot that bill, and we're going to deal with those big empty buildings where we're not going to be able to handle the heating bill, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. On so many levels in the next 10 to 15 years, I would rather have just, with the COVID shit, left everything open and let people make their own decisions. I left a lot of the things open anyway, and it just became too much of a top-down, a top-down nightmare in terms of management. The commerce and the industry, but it's still, at this point, they still want to do power grabs like that, and they still want to tell us how to live our lives, and that's the dangerous stuff. This is 2 years into COVID, telling us about our booster shots, telling us we got to do this, we're going to sign up for a registry. No, you know what I mean? We can stand up here and we can say no. I don't need Don Young, who's lived 50 years in Washington, D.C. You know what I mean? He was born and raised in California and went to college out of California. He did some army work. No one's taken away from Don Young's accomplishments, but very briefly in Alaska, and as a teacher, not as a blue collar working class person, so as a state senator or representative or something, I don't need him to tell me he's going to vote for a forced jab directory or for a trial period, or we're going to start logging and how much people drive, and we're going to be penalized for driving distances and stuff like that. With Pete Buttigieg, who's taking maternity leave, Illinois. That's not the future of the nation that I'm part of, and I'm not going to sit on the sidelines and watch these guys do that, because that stuff might not affect them in Washington, D.C. They might not be driving. They might not be a small business owner. They might not be, a person whose salary depends upon a business being left open. But that stuff affects working America and working Alaska. Those decisions that they make while they're crafting and while they're signing off on that legislation in Washington, D.C. So, I think we need to start standing up. We need to get some better people in there. We need to demand them to translate why they're voting for this legislation in terms of these Build Back Better. And it's, and these Democrat state senators and representatives in Alaska are just like, this state, Alaska, is going to become a Democratic state if someone doesn't wake up and stop the mudslide that's going that direction, is what I'm saying. So that's the theme of this little speech rant, I guess. Not just the Don Young thing, but, Don Young should write a book, and we don't want Alaska to become a Democratic state, I don't think. And Alaska is like, there's all kinds of problems in Alaska. There's all kinds of great things in Alaska, just like any other place. So it's not unique in terms of those political issues, but it's unique because we have the Alaskan representatives and senators who seem to be just getting in this. They're making decisions that cross the line and vote Democrat, and it's really changing things on the national level. So that's why I'm sort of like, what's going on? You know what I mean? I don't think that data supports some of the stuff that they're doing. If you really look at it and you look at the long term, is it something that's going to be sustainable? Why can't we just, we don't want to restrict, and then give people handouts of money. We want to leave things open and allow the economy to flourish and for things to develop on their own. I believe, instead of trying to regulate, and then give out handouts, that's not the right approach in terms of economic development, in terms of social development, but how you craft legislation and how it impacts people and communities. I really question and challenge some of those decisions, and I'm not the expert. So if I'm interpreting things wrong, and again, there's so much misinformation out there. Those House of Representatives people, those senators, they're the ones who are elected and chosen to be the ones who share and translate this legislation, its effects. But I don't see the empirical data and evidence that supports, some of the things and claims that I'm seeing they make about the legislation, because I think it's going to have negative effects in the long term on communities, on people, and on small businesses, on our youth, and on our, the generation that's coming after my generation as well as my generation. These guys are so old. Don Young, Lisa Murkowski, they're artifacts of a different You know, it's a different generation, and I'm not really the young generation. I don't have a smartphone, but you know what I'm trying to say? We live in a technological different place now, even than 10, 15 years ago, and we have to appreciate that the nuances of how it shapes and affects the way we communicate issues and the way we communicate things. And I'm not sure the senators and the representatives are doing the best that they could in terms of being communicators to the communities they represent and their constituents, if that makes sense. So, I'd love to see Don Young put out a big book at some point, whether he's going to stay as the House of Representative or not, and talk about the history of the last 50 years in Washington D.C. And maybe his whole life history too, but specifically the last 50 years, what he's done and how it shaped the country and where he feels like the country is going, and maybe some of his recent choices as well in terms of signing off on some democratic legislation there as a representative for Alaska.